Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place on the 7th of November of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the South Donetsk direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation. First we're going to discuss the situation in the vicinity of the village by the name of Velika Novohrodivka. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the group of forces east in this direction were bombing and attacking the forces of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, and the positions of 113th Territory Defense Brigade. As a result of bombardments, the Ukrainians suffered losses in the area of the village of Novokamar, Razdolne, and Velika Novohrodivka. So, summarizing everything, the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians on the line between these three villages, which means that most likely the Russians began the artillery preparation before the beginning of the full-scale offensive. So, most likely during the next several days, we're going to receive first videos and first geolocations that confirm Russian attempts to attack these three settlements, or at least Russian attempts to get as close as possible to the main supply roads and to encircle, or at least to cut, the Velika Novohrodivka village in operational encirclement. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the village of Bogayavlenka. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to take under control this dense network of the fortifications. Now there are no more barriers between the Russians and the village of Sukhe Yali. Now the Russians most likely will begin their frontline attack using the broad frontline tactic in the direction of the villages between the settlement of Uspenovka and Yelizavetovka. The Russian sources published the video of how big Russian convoys were moving towards the Ukrainian positions. This is very interesting and very important video. There are several things I would like to point to your attention. As you can see, there is already frost on the surface, which is very important. This allows us to understand which videos are old and which videos are fresh and recent. Furthermore, we can see lots of Russian vehicles. Some of them were returning back after the landing operation. Some of them were just heading towards the Ukrainian positions. And the most important thing, we haven't seen even a single Ukrainian resistance. So most likely tomorrow different mappers will adjust their map further in Russian favor, and something like this might be captured by the Russians during these 24 hours by the morning of the 12th of November. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Kurakhove direction, about the northern part, about the area of the responsibilities of the group of forces center. We have a lot of changes on the ground, as you can see. And first let's talk about the village of Ilinka. In this video we can see the Ukrainian tank that was attacking the Russian positions within a very short distance. All these buildings were captured by the Russians, at least according to the author of this video. The Ukrainians sent a tank in this direction, and the Ukrainian tank was attacking the Russian forces. Based on this video, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps in Russian favor. This direction is very dynamic. Just today we got reports about the Russian presence on the territory of village itself. Yesterday we got the video with the Russian flag in the most central part of the village by the name of Stepanovka. Furthermore, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation also confirmed control over these settlements. So the Russians are moving further and further in the western direction. We see that currently the Ukrainians can't do anything with this. Furthermore, the sources reported that the Russians currently already storming the settlement of Berestkin. Some pro-Russian resources reported about the Russian presence already on the territory of the settlement. Other Russian sources are saying that the first Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group and stormtroopers managed to enter the village of Sontsovka. So as you can see, the Russians are advancing, and once again the Ukrainians currently can't do anything with this. As for the geolocations, first let's talk about the village of Novohrodivka. The Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were bombing and attacking and FPV droning the Russian forces in the most eastern part of the settlement. In this video we can see the movements of Russian soldiers exactly along this street, along the Sadova street, and the Ukrainians were bombing the Russians there. This video confirms at least Russian control over the northern part of the settlement. As for the village of Kreminna and Balka, today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the group of forces center managed to establish complete control over this settlement. Based on this report and based on this video, we have adjusted these territories in Russian favor. So this is the situation by the end of this 6th of November. As you can see, the village of Kreminna, Balka, and the eastern part of Novohrodivka were already under complete control, almost complete control of the armed force of Russian Federation. At least that was stated by different mappers. But just today, on the 7th of November, we got both the Ministry of Defense report and the first geolocation. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the territory to the southwest of Selidov. As you can see, we also have changes on the ground. The Russian forces continue offensive operation towards this dense network of the fortifications, and according to information we have, according to information that was published both by pro-Ukrainian mappers and neutral mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to take under control the third stronghold company stronghold among this dense network of the fortifications. Obviously, this is the significant progress of the armed force of Russian Federation. The Russians are not planning to stop. They are moving further in the western direction. As for the village by the name of Novohrodivka, today we have several videos from this territory. For example, in this video, we can see Russian soldiers, 3 Russian soldiers that were raising the flag in the eastern part of the settlement. Based on this video, most of the mappers have adjusted the map, at least this part of the settlement, under complete Russian control. So there are no doubts that the Russians control this part of the settlement. Later, we got another video that was published by pro-Ukrainian sources, and in this video, we can see 3 Russian soldiers that were standing in the northwestern part of the settlement. They were talking, and they feel themselves very free, very careful, very comfortable. They didn't expect any Ukrainian drone in this area. 3 Russian soldiers were staying in front of the burning building, and in the final part of the video, the Ukrainians decided to FPV drone the Russians with grenades. Based on this video, we have adjusted this part of the village by the name of Novohrodivka in Russian favor. Now let's compare the map. This is the situation by the end of the 6th of November, and this is the situation by the end of the 7th of November. At least 60-70% of the settlement is already under complete Russian control, and the Russians are moving further. And based on this video, we can make a conclusion that the Russians most likely are already on the territory of the village by the name of Yudivka, because the Russians were too calm and too, I don't know, they were feeling themselves too free in this area. It's obviously the territory around, by the time the video was made, most likely the territory around these points so already weren't under Ukrainian control at all. Now let's move to the Novohrodivka, and today we got very important video from the coal mine Novohrodivka III. The Russian sources published the video from the, let's say, camera from the first-person view of how the Russian stormtroopers were clearing the industrial zone itself, the mine itself, and the Terikon itself. Very long video, 2.5 minutes, and the Russians were showing how they were moving from one part of the mine to another, and some of the episodes were geolocated exactly in the most northern part, at least, of the industrial zone. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map completely and in Russian favor. So we can make a conclusion that today, on the 7th of November, the Russians secured the territory of the mine and the Terikon completely. Now let's move further. As for the TDS direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. We see that both the Russians and the Ukrainians reduced their activities till minimum. Maybe the Russians will continue this offensive after the end of the battle for Kurakhove. As for Sivers direction, we continue receiving more and more updates about the Russian attempt to attack this territory, about the Russian offensives, several offensives that were conducted, that have been conducted since the 30th of October, and we have some changes on the ground. First of all, according to neutral mappers, the Russians managed to restore control over the village of Vimka itself and to move further along the railways. Furthermore, we got another geolocation that was published by pro-Ukrainian sources. In this video, we can see how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian positions along the tree line, and how Ukraine FPV drone was attacking the Russian forces exactly in this point. Based on this video, we have also adjusted this part of the Sivers bridgehead in Russian favor. Now let's take a look at the dynamic. So this is the situation by the end of the 4th of November, so 3 days ago. This is the situation by the end of the 5th of November. The Russians managed to take under control the village of Novohrodivka. This conclusion was made based on this video, how Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians who lost themselves on the territory of the ruins. On the 6th of November, we got additional reports that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the village of Vimka, taking the most northwestern part of the settlement, and we got several videos that confirmed Russian control and Russian attack towards the company stronghold from the east. And on the 7th of November, we got additional changes on the ground in the area of Russian attack from the east and additional progress along the railways. As for attack in the eastern direction, most likely the Russians currently are trying to outflank the Ukrainian positions in this company stronghold and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Anyway, we can make a conclusion that most likely this stronghold still remains under strong control of by the armed forces of Ukraine, and most likely the Russians suffered the significant losses during these attacks, during those attempts. At least that was stated by different pro-Russian resources. The Russians are saying that these several attacks that have been conducted since the beginning of November weren't prepared by the Russians at all. The sources are saying that the Russians began those offensives without any artillery preparations. Maybe the Russians were trying to keep this attack in silent, to keep this attack in secret, and they didn't want to reveal their own plans by artillery preparation, so that's why they began full-scale offensive from many sides with a significant number of armored vehicles, of tanks and personnel, and the Russians suffered the significant losses. At least that was stated by pro-Russian resources. Currently there are a lot of wounded among these fields and the Russians can't evacuate them. But anyway, the Russians managed to get as close as possible to this company stronghold, so most likely the Russians are not planning to stop. Most likely during the next several days they're gonna send additional forces, additional waves of attack with the purpose to answer the stronghold itself and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. So let's wait for additional updates and we'll see what is going to be next. If the Russians are able to take this stronghold under complete control, this is going to be a perfect position for the Russians to move further in the western direction with the purpose to outflank Verkhnekamensk and to attack the settlement from behind. So let's wait. Now let's move further and let's talk about the northern Kupiansk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we have some changes on the ground. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in the village of Sinkovo, trying to destroy the upcoming reinforcements and reserves, and the Russians managed to improve their positions in the direction of Kupiansk itself. At least that was confirmed by different videos that were published by the Ukrainians. In this video, we can see the Ukrainian FPV drone operators that were attacking edge Russian positions in this forest. Different mappers adjusted some part of this forest in the direction of the railway station Kolesnikovka. So the Russians are moving in the northwestern direction with the purpose to reach this line. If the Russians are able to take under control this forest, then this is going to be a perfect bridgehead and foothold before further advance in the direction of the villages, settlements like Kivsharovka, Novohrodivka, and Kupiansk-Uzlovoy. So this is going to be a perfect position where the Russians will be able to hide their forces. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Kursk direction. Right before we start making this video, we got very important, we start receiving very important posts from pro-Russian sources that the Russians have begun the third wave of a counteroffensive operation. The Russians are using the significant number of tanks, armored vehicles. The Russians are counterattacking, and most likely during the next 24 hours we're gonna start receiving first videos and first updates about the situation on the ground. So the Russians began, and maybe this might be the last Russian attack. Most likely Ukrainians would be completely defeated and they would be forced to fall back. You know that during the previous 24 hours we got a lot of very interesting statements exactly from this territory. First, right after Joe Biden, the 46th president of the United States of America, was defeated, we got report that Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, is preparing to withdraw troops from the Kursk region. Before this statement, we got reports about first clashes between North Koreans and Ukrainian soldiers themselves. And later we got another report completely opposite from pro-Russian resources, that the Ukrainians didn't withdraw their positions, but opposite, the Ukrainians bring the significant number of forces in the Kursk area. And now we understand why the Ukrainians brought additional forces, because most likely the Ukrainians received intelligence information that the Russians are about to begin the third wave of a counter-offensive operation, and they realized that there are very high chances the Ukrainians might be defeated and the Ukrainians might suffer the significant losses. So just to stabilize the situation, the Ukrainians brought additional reinforcements and reserves, and now we start receiving updates about the Russian counteroffensive, about the third wave of Russian counteroffensive operations. So let's wait for additional updates. Once again, most likely tomorrow we're gonna start receiving a lot of videos, and maybe the Russians will raise several flags at least in the northwestern or in the southeastern parts of the Sudra direction. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you can there many violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.